All right, so let's talk about evapotranspiration in plants. And this is a real-world implication of intermolecular forces and has a huge impact on the ecology of the entire plant. So one of the questions is, how do plants get water from the roots in the ground to the top of the tree? How do you get water to go uphill against the force of gravity to reach the top of the tree? It has everything to do with the concepts that we've talked about already, which is adhesion, cohesion, surface tension, and capillary action. Now, when we look at what we call the non-vascular plants, these are some of the most ancient forms of plants on Earth. Their relatives were the first plants that came onto the land from the ocean. We're talking about your mosses, your horsetails, and your ferns. Now, these plants do not have a mechanism by which to get water from the ground to the tops of the leaves over very much of a distance. They're almost completely reliant on diffusion and capillary action to get the water up from the ground to their roots. Because of that, these plants tend to have to live in pretty moist environments where there's plentiful water that's able to work its way up. And so, living in the Pacific Northwest, that we get quite a bit of water. The soil stays wet pretty much most of the year. And so that allows moss to basically soak that water in like a sponge. It allows ferns and horsetails to move water up over short distances. But typically, you're not going to see these plants get more than a couple of feet tall. You might have a 2 or 3 foot tall sword fern, maybe a 2 or 3 feet tall horsetail, and that's pretty much it. They're not going to get much taller than that because of this inability to move water up against the force of gravity. Capillary action only gets you so far. Now, back in the ancient days, but the first forests, if you will, were in the Devonian era, and we didn't have the modern flowering trees and conifers that we have today. They were forests of horsetails and tree ferns, and these forests basically were limited in height to about 30 feet. That was the highest that you could possibly get water to go up. And so these were the early forests. And then the vascular plants came along and were able to kind of change everything about how the ecology of the planet proceeded. But these plants basically were limited in their height and dominated the early Earth before that. But they always had to live in really wet environments that had enormous amounts of water nearby. We're talking swamps and very wet tropical rainforest-like environments. In drier parts of the planet, these plants would not have been very successful. So let's take a look at what happens when vascular plants come on the scene. So vascular plants have these vascular tissues, basically the xylem and the phloem, that are used to move fluids up and down the tree. The xylem cells are lined up almost like a straw, where water is able to work its way up from the roots to the top. And the key here is that water molecules are sticking to the sides of the xylem tissue through adhesion. As the water works its way up through the xylem, it's going to be able to pull water molecules in behind it due to cohesion. So adhesion and cohesion are both really important to the story. So then the question is, what's the mechanism by which water is going up? Because capillary action can only take you so far. Capillary action is only going to take you up a few feet. How do you get up to the top of a 200-foot tall tree? Well, that's where the evapotranspiration comes in. So plants have these stomata in their leaves that open up and allow water molecules to evaporate out into the atmosphere. As those water molecules evaporate into the air, they pull the water molecule that they're attached to behind them and put them at the opening of the stomata. That pull creates a chain reaction that pulls behind it and pulls behind it. And so it's like that everyone's pulling all the way up from the top of the tree all the way down to the roots, which draws moisture into the roots. This creates this pulling, if you will, is called negative water pressure. And it is a suction force, if you will, that's forcing water to pull in from behind it. There's a video that I've posted on evapotranspiration that I want you to check out that goes into more detail on this, what this negative water pressure is all about. So once vascular plants came along, which are your conifers first and later your flowering trees, you were able to pull water up through evapotranspiration up to a height of about 300 feet. Now, it's believed that 300 feet is the physics calculations maximum height of a tree. And yet there are some redwoods who exceed that height. And so one of the areas of research is, how do they do it when it seems like 300 feet's the maximum and there's a few trees that can actually get up above that? And so there clearly is more to learn about this process, but evapotranspiration is the key. All right, so just kind of taking a closer look at this with these negative water pressures, what you'll see here is as the water is evaporating out of the leaf through the stomata, that's your transpiration, it pulls water from behind it, cohesion and adhesion forces. The nice thing about adhesion is that when it's nighttime or when evaporation is not going on, when those stomata close, the water doesn't just go shooting straight back down the tube and into the ground, because the water molecules are sticking to the sides of the xylem through adhesion. And so they're able to kind of hold their position when the xylem is closed, and the pressure remains that's essentially holding them up. But that goes all the way down to the ground where water is entering through the root hairs and into the tissues. You can reach incredible negative pressures of negative 100 megapascals. At negative all right, so to learn more about this, go ahead and check out that video 4.4 transpiration. So let's just talk a little bit about what can interfere with the ability of plants to pull water in. So salt in the soil can damage trees. And so if you live in an area where they salt the roads to cause freezing point depression, one thing you'll notice is that oftentimes the trees near that road will be showing stress or maybe dying off. Here's a bunch of bushes along the edge of this sidewalk area where they were adding salt to keep the ice off the sidewalk, and it's killing them off. But why does salt damage trees? This has to do with osmosis. Basically, what's going on is that as you put more and more salt on the outside of the plant, osmosis will result in water moving out of the plant cells to try to equalize that concentration. And so as water moves out of the cells, it's not able to work its way up to the leaves because it's leaving the tree as opposed to entering the tree. And so this change in concentration of salts from inside versus outside affects the ability of a tree to move water to its leaves. Under normal circumstances, there's more salts in the tree than outside, so water is going to flood into the roots of the tree to try to equalize that pressure. And once it's in the tree, inside that xylem, it can be pulled up with negative water pressure to the leaves. But if you add salt to the outside environment through salting of the roads or salting of the sidewalks, water is going to move the opposite direction. Essentially what you're doing is dehydrating that tree, and that will result in stress and eventual death of the tree if it's bad enough.